Star Wars has no shortage of spectacular imagery. It's a big, mythic, galactic scale story, after all. But when I think about the best shots in Star Wars, I'm not imagining the most visually attractive compositions that might make a nice desktop wallpaper. I'm imagining shots that are structural parts of the wider film, that through the camera work and how the action plays out, they really assist the theming and storytelling. So with that in mind, what would my picks be for the best shots in the 6 George Lucas Star Wars films? For my first choice, it's fitting that it's actually the very first shot in all of Star Wars. What's amazing about this single shot is just how much it establishes, with such straightforward action and camera work. First, we see multiple moons and a desert planet. This is a really good choice to immediately reinforce that we're not in an earthly context. Of course, the film does start with a galaxy far, far away, but the exact wording of the intro text and the crawl were in flux pretty late into production, and little else in this movie truly establishes it as an alien environment. The planet Tatooine, for instance, is never named on screen, and without seeing these multiple moons and later in the film multiple suns, we could in theory imagine that R2 and 3PO have crashed on a futuristic desertified Earth, or just in Tunisia. We take our knowledge of the Star Wars universe for granted, but Star Wars at one point was literally just a movie, and choices like this are not necessarily obvious during the production to transport us to an unambiguously alien environment. It was really smart to get this visual out in front of the audience immediately. Then we get the blockade runner. It's just familiar enough for the audience to identify it as a conventional rocket ship sort of vehicle, so we can intuitively understand the scale and speed of this thing, and just as we get the sense that it's fleeing under weapons fire, we get the Star Destroyer, a colossal futuristic battleship that just keeps going and going and going, and now we've basically got a summary of the entire Star Wars saga in the very first shot. Plucky, familiar underdogs persecuted by technologically overwhelming powers. Really, an opening shot this good basically makes the entire opening crawl irrelevant. Now, it's good to have that context for a completely new world, but this very first Star Wars film begins flawlessly. My pick for The Empire Strikes Back might be a bit more controversial though, because I think I'm gonna have to say that the best shot here is when a rebel soldier first identifies an Imperial walker through his electro-binoculars. We're introduced to these terrifying, incredible machines, not as an objective, omniscient audience on Earth, but through the eyes of a soldier who's there. Now, Star Wars up to this point already did have a number of point of view shots like this, but this one really stands out. Firstly, it's unparalleled in just how real it looks, and in how effectively it transports us into the boots on the ground reality of warfare in the Star Wars galaxy. It's almost like a shot from a documentary, and it's a fantastic way to start this sequence. Now, Star Wars is ultimately a fairy tale that works well with a more iconic storybookish visual style, but these brief glimpses into the eyes of the characters communicate to us that it's real for someone, and this shot remains effective because it's a break from the norm. These fantasy vehicles end up being the most real thing in the movie because they're introduced directly through the eyes of someone who's there. But it is good that the rest of the presentation of the walkers is more properly cinematic. My pick for The Return of the Jedi is probably the closest I'll get to highlighting a shot for purely aesthetic reasons, because this shot is just really cool and I had to talk about it. As the Falcon flies away from the exploding reactor core of the Death Star, there's this really cool effect where the shot feels like it rapidly picks up speed without actually changing speed at all, because the Falcon moves from the expansive reactor chamber into the tight tunnel that leads to it, suddenly giving us this relative reference for how fast we're actually flying, and it gives this amazing sense of really punching into full throttle to escape the blast. It serves as an effective transition from the sense of space and breathing room that we got in the reactor chamber back into the high-speed claustrophobic tunnel chase. It's the perfect kickstart to the final minute of the Battle of Endor, and it's easily my favorite shot of the movie. Moving on to the prequel trilogy, the shot in The Phantom Menace that I just kept coming back to was when the Naboo fighters are launching to attack the droid control ship. One unlucky pilot is struck by tank fire, putting his fighter into an apparently uncontrollable spin, and the camera sticks with him all the way to the bitter end. And these sorts of shots are something of their own genre in Star Wars. We get a number of shots that linger on these sorts of crashes and explosions, but this one really stood out to me. There's a highlighted sense of randomness here, an impression of sheer luck of whether or not any one of these pilots will survive the battle. So there's a tragic undercurrent to a shot like this. Even though there's nothing really manipulative or melodramatic here, there's no visible human being, the music isn't sad, but this is an emotionally complicated shot simply because of what the camera is following and how long the shot is held. There's also a really interesting role that this shot plays in the story. It subconsciously sets up the audience's expectation for how these starfighters behave when they take damage, because Anakin himself will later catch laser fire in the same engine on his fighter, which also sends him into a seemingly uncontrollable spin until he barely regains control and manages a crash landing that puts him into exactly the right place to make that critical strike. So this one shot here, though it might otherwise seem like kind of a random action shot, is actually setting up quite a bit, including the climax of the entire film. For Attack of the Clones, my pick is going to be the very first shot of the movie again. Something obviously unique about this shot is that in defiance of Star Wars convention, the camera pans up at the beginning. And for a long time, this sat really wrongly with me. I always wished that it had been like all the other films, but in retrospect, it's kind of a genius decision, because before anything at all has happened in the movie, this single camera move instantly communicates to the audience that something is wrong, which is a tone that fits the whole film. And what I love about this is how purely cinematic it is. This is storytelling with the camera that is only possible in motion picture, completely unique to this art form, and furthermore, unique to Star Wars. You can't just start any movie with this camera move and get the same effect. This works on us because we've seen 4 Star Wars films before this. We know what to expect at this point, so it's a brilliant subversion to set the tone, and I don't know that there's anything quite like it in the Star Wars saga. Revenge of the Sith was kind of a hard pick, not because there are just so many options, but because this movie jumps all over the place and has so much stuff happening simultaneously that the movie rarely breathes enough to allow any given shot to communicate more than just the immediate action. That is, of course, with one enormous exception, when the tone of the movie comes to an unnervingly screeching halt, in the best way possible, I'd say, when Anakin is in the Jedi Council chamber deliberating whose side he's really on. And now that we've narrowed down our pick to this sequence, it's easy to pick the best shot in this sequence, where the weight of Anakin's dilemma has finally broken him. He's made up his mind, and he literally turns from the light, the last sunset of the Republic. But the extra punch comes from realizing that Anakin, though he's ostensibly choosing to save Padme, has actually turned away from her as well. This whole sequence, we've gotten the sense that Anakin and Padme are looking directly at each other, whether or not they're really truly consciously aware of it. And as Anakin turns his back to commit his dark deeds, he has not only turned his back on the light, but on Padme as well, who we can see in the very next shot, still watching for Anakin. Ultimately, none of these shots exists in isolation. They establish tone and set expectations. They're subtly contributing to themes and setting up payoffs, usually without drawing hardly any attention to themselves, which is why I would say a really great shot doesn't need to be visually spectacular. It needs to be deliberate and intentional. And then when you build a movie like that, shot by shot, you've got an enduring classic on your hands, which is why we're still talking about the cinematography of Star Wars nearly 50 years later.